My name is Martin Cannon. A short while ago, I offered up a presentation about 3 great mysteries. That video attracted a pretty substantial audience, at least by the standards of this channel. It's not been around for very long. I'm very grateful for all of the new subscribers. So today I've decided to look at 3 more weird stories from days of yore. If you look around the nooks and crannies of our history books, you'll find some fascinating oddities. Now, like many of you, I'm looking for mysteries that are not just mysterious, but unfamiliar. Now, I don't think that the stories I'm about to tell you have received a whole lot of exposure on other video channels and podcasts. Truly hardcore Forteans might have some familiarity with 1 or 2 of these stories, but for most of you this material will seem new. The Clinton Correctional Facility is often called Dannemora. It opened in 1845. For years, the prisoners were used essentially as a slave labor force. They served in the local mines. There was an insane asylum built on the prison grounds in 1899. Weirdly, for a while this facility served as a kind of health resort within the nation's prison system. You see, in the days before antibiotics, convicts with tuberculosis were sent here because the prison is in the Adirondacks, and it was thought that the air had curative powers. And in a surprisingly large number of cases, the health of the prisoners did indeed improve. Today, Dannemora is the largest maximum security prison in the state. The prison is sometimes known as Little Siberia because it is located in a particularly frigid part of upstate New York. The most bizarre incident in this facility's history occurred in February 1920, as documented in the June 1920 issue of The Electrical Experimenter. This article, which was rediscovered by Forteans in the Internet age, extensively quotes correspondence from the prison doctor, one Julius B. Ransom. Now, he was a very respected figure, and he was particularly noted for his work with tuberculosis. His colleagues had no choice but to pay attention when he reported on a phenomenon, which he regarded as inexplicable. 34 prisoners had contracted botulism after eating a very questionable batch of canned salmon. Now, none of the prisoners died, but some went blind, or nearly blind. And while these prisoners convalesced, they became magnetic. That is to say, objects would stick to them. And we are not talking about metallic objects. Everything that touched them became magnetized. According to Ransom, quote, "One of the patients who was convalescing crumpled up a piece of paper, I imagine in both hands, and attempted to throw it in a wastebasket. It absolutely refused to leave his hand. From this time on, experiments were made, and the matter was reported to me. And I found that every case of botulinous poisoning developed this strange power, and that neither the attendants nor the nurses associated with them had any such power." A little further on, quote, "For instance, forms of paper, such as newspapers and ordinary correspondence paper, when electrified by these patients and thrown against the wall, adhered and clung to any object for many hours. By again rubbing the hands together and running the electrical light bulb, the filament will begin to vibrate very rapidly and follow the motions of the hands. The compass needle of a surveyor's instrument can be rotated with any piece of paper electrified by these patients. A steel tape suspended will feel the magnetic field in a remarkable manner and sway from side to side." End quote. Ransom cited other cases of botulism in which the poisoned individuals would reportedly glow in the dark. It was posited that the botulism caused a dry skin condition which somehow contributed to the phenomenon. Dr. Ransom found that the inmates could perform the same tricks while in a tub of water. Once the prisoners regained their health, the magnetism ceased. We should note that Electrical Experimenter was edited by Hugo Gernsback, who was one of the fathers of science fiction. In fact, he invented the term science fiction, and the Hugo Award was named after him. Gernsback almost certainly wrote the above-quoted article, which lacks a byline. So the thought occurs to me, could he have concocted the whole thing? He did arouse some controversy back in the day. One of his writers, H.P. Lovecraft, called him Hugo the Rat. Now, that said, no one ever accused Gernsback of perpetrating a journalistic hoax. In fact, in later years he became quite famous as an opponent of fraudsters. He was particularly venomous toward L. Ron Hubbard. Now, as it turns out, Hugo Gernsback got everything right. See, I found other sources which basically confirm the main points in his article. The April the 5th, 1920 edition of the New York Times covered Ransom's remarkable claims about human magnetism at the prison, and the headline, "Clinton Convicts Turned into Magnets by Botulinus Germ in Canned Salmon." According to the New York Times, Ransom wrote a lengthy report on the phenomena. I strongly suspect that this report still exists somewhere in the prison's archives. I mean, who would toss a thing like that away? I certainly wish someone would dig it up. That said, I have to admit, the whole idea seems preposterous. How could there possibly be any link between botulism and human magnetism? How could a bad can of salmon give you extraordinary powers? I mean, that sounds like the stupidest superhero origin story ever. Well, with the possible exception of a Golden Age hero called the Wizard, who also had the stupidest name ever. You've probably never heard of the Wizard, but look him up. If the MCU ever makes a movie about that guy, it is all over. So back to the phenomenon of human magnetism. Over the years, a number of people have demonstrated this allegedly paranormal ability. Supposedly they can make spoons and other objects stick to their bodies. Now, the human body does indeed generate tiny electromagnetic fields, but they are way too weak to lift metal objects. You would need superhuman levels of magnetism actually to attract metal, the way these human magnets claim that they can do. The thing is, so-called magnetic people do not just attract metal. They can also make plastic and glass objects stick to their skin. Magnets don't work on plastic. So, what's really going on? Famously magnetic personalities include Aurel Răileanu of Romania, and I don't know whether I'm pronouncing that man's name correctly. I don't speak Romanian. I apologize if I got it wrong. I believe he's still alive. He's a hospital employee, and he has been photographed with heavy items like irons stuck to his body. One photo even shows a 60-pound TV set attached to his chest like a gigantic leech. Răileanu has one thing in common with the prisoners of Dannemora. They both demonstrated their abilities while in a hospital setting. In Malaysia, a man named Liu Tao Lin, who died in 2013, gained a reputation as the Magnetic Man. He was once a contractor who found that his tools had the mystifying habit of sticking to his body. Once he even dragged a car by a cable that was attached to a metal plate that was stuck onto his body. The most extensive online account of Liu Tao Lin offers this explanatory paragraph, quote, "Scientists are not completely sure why the otherwise average Liu Tao Lin could trot around the house with soup spoons stuck firmly to his pectoral muscles. Scientists at the University of Technology in Malaysia brought him in to check for some form of magnetism, which would seem the most obvious answer. But they found that his body did not have a magnetic field that was any stronger than the average person's. So, though he goes by Mr. Magnetism, he's not magnetic at all. What scientists did find out upon further testing was that Liu Tao Lin had abnormally high levels of friction present in his skin, and this makes his skin stickier than the average person's, which could be responsible for the strong suction that allowed him to heft his car down the street. His sticky skin, it turns out, is genetic. His 3 grandchildren all exhibit varying levels of his ability." End quote. Now, skeptics of the James Randi school have argued that friction and sweat account for the alleged magnetism. It turns out that human skin is surprisingly tacky, especially when it is smooth and hairless. Our bodies naturally produce oils that create a thin adhesive layer, and some people just happen to have skin that's stickier than average. You combine that with smooth objects like the back of a spoon, and you have got a recipe for some impressive-looking stunts. This trick works even better when the person leans back slightly, letting gravity do some of the work. Now, it's the same principle that lets you stick a wet glass to a smooth table. No magnets required. So, arch-skeptic James Randi came up with a simple test. Talcum powder. All you do is dust the skin with talcum powder, and suddenly the magnetic powers disappear. The skeptical explanation covers a number of these claims, but does it account for the photographs of Aurel Relinu? At this point, all I can do is ask you to look at the photos. Come to your own conclusions. Moreover, I am not sure that this particular skeptical scenario covers the events at Dannemora. Dr. Ransom was very well trained and observant. He insisted that the prisoners could demonstrate this ability even when they were in a tub of water. He also said that they could transfer the magnetic ability from their bodies to whatever object they were holding. He also reported that the prisoners developed this ability temporarily, only after they experienced botulism poisoning. So, can a bout with botulism in some way make skin gummier, at least for a brief time? Unfortunately, I can't think of any way to test that idea, unless you deliberately expose a human test subject to botulism, and obviously that is out of the question. The next time you see a viral video of someone covered in metal objects, remember, whatever is going on, it's not magnetism. And if a bit of talcum powder makes the magic disappear, well, maybe it was never magic to begin with. Now, I want to tell you this story not because I find it extraordinarily credible, but because there's just nothing else quite like it. Thanks to the MCU, everyone now knows all about Thor's hammer Mjolnir, which cannot be lifted except by one who is deemed worthy. Few people know that in a small community in Maryland, a church once owned a Bible which possessed a similar ability. It rested on the lectern at the head of the Old Nazareth Church in the Pokomoke Forest. You can find that church in the Furnace-Town Living Heritage Museum, which is at 3816 Old Furnace Road, Snow Hill, Maryland. You'll have to ask the docents if it is possible to inspect the book. Frankly, I'm not at all sure that they will allow you that privilege. The story is told in a book by Mindy Burgoyne called The Haunted Lower Eastern Shore. The title refers to the shore of the Chesapeake Bay. Now, she has written other books with very similar titles, so if you want to order this volume, be careful. I consider her a fine researcher in her very specialized field. Now, this story takes place in the Pokomoke Forest, which has attracted all sorts of legends and lore over the years. The following is from Burgoyne's text. Shortly after the Civil War, Pernell Pusey and his wife donated some land in the Pokomoke Forest near Furnace-Town to the Methodist community. The Old Nazareth Church was built on the site, and it operated for nearly 70 years as a small country church. Members of the Pusey family, as well as others from the community, were buried in the graveyard that flanked the simple church building. In the mid-20th century, the Methodist Conference stopped recognizing this small church, and it was abandoned. As time passed, the empty church and the graveyard became associated with haunted tales, phantom figures stalking the graveyard, bleeding headstones, and other strange happenings. But the most famous of the tales related to this church was that of the Heavy Bible. The little white church in the woods was said to have a Bible that stayed on a lectern near the altar. Differing stories vary on where the Bible was placed. If a person lifted the Bible and tried to walk away from the lectern, the Bible would get heavier until it was too heavy for anyone to actually hold. Therefore, it could never be removed from the church. One of the commonly told stories is of two boys who stole their way into the abandoned church at midnight, intending to break the spell of the Heavy Bible. They removed it from the lectern and started to carry it to the door. The Bible became burdensome, and when the boys got halfway down the church aisle, the weight of the book overpowered them. But when they began to move back in the direction of the lectern, the heaviness lifted. They replaced the Bible and left the church, terrified. Another account is of two men who, like the boys, failed to remove the Bible, yet still gave it a second try, using a wheelbarrow. They rolled the wheelbarrow up to the lectern and carefully placed the Bible in it. As they started to push it down the aisle toward the door, the wheelbarrow became too heavy to push. Halfway down, it wouldn't budge, and appeared to be on the verge of collapsing under the weight. As the two men started to pull the wheelbarrow back toward the lectern, the weight lightened, and it moved smoothly with no resistance. There are even accounts of men trying to throw the Bible out the window. But when people heave the Bible into the air, tossing it in the direction of an open window, the Bible drops to the floor like a hunk of lead. In the 1970s, folklore students at Salisbury University collected accounts from former parishioners relating the tale of the heavy Bible. The interview subjects all insisted that the book really did increase in weight. Unfortunately, they offered only second- and third-hand reports. Here are a few examples. My uncle went to the church and went up to that altar and lifted that Bible up. It didn't seem very heavy, so he started to carry it towards the door. But as he got closer and closer, that blamed Bible, it got heavier and heavier. Then he had this funny feeling come over him like the chills and shakes, so he walked that Bible right back up and scooted out of that place. Now that quotation comes from somebody listed as Jeff F. The story was collected by university students in June of 1973. Sitting on the altar there was an old Bible. It's written partially in Hebrew and partially in English. It's not chained or attached to the altar in any way, but it cannot be taken out of the church in any manner. Someone carrying it can get to a door or to a window, but no further. There's the feeling that something is pulling them back into the church. Supposedly, several boys went to the church to remove the Bible, and when they got to the door, there was a strong wind. Some of the windows broke, and the boys carrying the Bible fell through the floor, and they were never found. Now, that story was collected from somebody known only as Iris K. in September of 1972. One interviewee told a variant story in which anyone trying to move the Bible would see a vision of the church surrounded by fire. Quote, "The reason they can't get the Bible out is because after they pick up the Bible, they can see a fire outside the window surrounding the entire church. They always drop the Bible." And that story came from somebody identified as Sherry R., and the story was collected in October of 1970. Now, the college students collected all this testimony, but the church itself was no longer an active house of worship. Nevertheless, it was a very historic building, and the community wanted to preserve it. They moved the entire structure, including all of its contents, 5 miles down the road to something called the Furnace-Town Living Heritage Museum. Obviously, moving the church meant moving the book. Perhaps the book was in the building while it was being transported. My sources are not quite clear on that point. But the book was moved, and today you can find both the church and the Bible in its new location in the Pokomoke Forest, one of the most haunted places in all of Maryland. The Old Darn Man, also known as Old Darncoat, was once one of the most talked about figures in this part of the United States. He was not a politician, a writer, an artist, or a businessman. In fact, he was a tramp, a homeless person. Yet he was beloved and respected by many. To this day, he remains a man of mystery. This nearly legendary figure began his endless trek circa 1820, the year of his great tragedy. He was left at the altar. For the rest of his life, he wore the formal black suit, replete with stovepipe hat, he had purchased for his wedding day. Thus attired, he traveled perpetually across Connecticut, Rhode Island, and parts of Massachusetts, never staying in one place for more than one night. He survived by doing odd jobs whenever they were offered. Otherwise, he accepted charity. People found him fascinating. The man was clearly well-read. He was cultured and intelligent, and he played the violin very well. Many people tried to draw him out, find out who he really was, but he refused to give his name. He refused to say anything about his place of origin. The fact that he kept him guessing is probably what made him such a welcome guest. One might even say that mystery was his bread and butter. Oh, he claimed to be a great misogynist, but he doesn't seem to have offended any of the women he met. Those who heard him out understood that a woman had once hurt him, and he still loved her. Over time, his long-tailed coat tore and frayed, and so he would mend it using a borrowed needle and thread, hence his nickname. And when the clothing developed windows, he would patch the opening with whatever fabric was made available to him. Over the course of decades, he became another Joseph, traveling the land in a coat of many colors. The story of the old darn man is told in the second volume of A Modern History of Windham County, Connecticut, published in 1902. Beginning on page 1021, we find the testimony of a Dr. Ayer who describes his family's encounters with this odd traveler. In no way could mother or father or anyone else I ever heard of find out his true name, where he was born, his nationality. He apparently was of English stock. He had a good knowledge of English history, of the men of the old days. At times, his talk would lead one to believe that he might have personal acquaintance with some of them, and he might have been born there, and it was possible that his evident disappointment in love might have been over in England, or perhaps Scotland, for he talked much of the Highlands and the moors of bonny Scotland, of the lassies and lads, and after his failure to marry, he may have come to this country. Well, that sounds a lot like Outlander. In his discourses on British history, he was particularly harsh on Queen Mary, who exemplified his mistrust of the female sex. Who was he? That lingering mystery continues to make him mythic. Thus, I am a little sad to report that, on a later page, A Modern History of Windham County, Connecticut offers the recollections of one Alan Jewett of Hampton. Quote, "He made no conversation except for his needs. He told my mother his name was George Johnson, and that he had 2 sisters living in Rhode Island." Did he really confess that fact to Mrs. Jewett and to no other human being? Maybe, maybe not. I really can't research the matter any further, because George Johnson is just such a common name I wouldn't know how to proceed. In the book Legendary Connecticut, David Phillips offers what he says are the darn man's quasi-Gnostic final words. "My bride will come tonight. Surely she will not disappoint me. Come, my beloved little bride." Now, supposedly he said these words just before being trampled to death by a carriage, which did not contain his bride. That story seems rather questionable to me, but it has a poetic quality. It is said by some that an unknown party laid him to rest in the wilds between Plainview and Sterling, and that the headstone may yet be found, if you look for it. Now, the story of the Darn Man reminds me of Ed Leedskalnin of Coral Castle fame in Florida. Now, he was another heartbroken figure who entered legend, but that is a story for another time. If you want to hear more of these stories, please like, please subscribe, and please tell others about Strange Tales.